Okay, hi folks in the room and folks who are joining us online. I'm Helen Kennedy. I'm the director of the ESRC Digital Good Network, one of the hosts for this event. For people that need it, we're giving visual descriptions of ourselves. So I'm a white woman. Let's say I'm in my 50s. I'm dressed in black and I've got a red lobster necklace on. I'm going to hand over to Jenny Gilbert now.
Hi, good evening everyone. I'm Jenny Gilbert, Knowledge Exchange Manager for the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of Sheffield. I am a white woman in my very late 30s. I've got glasses and reddish hair and a green dress that I realised for shame clashes somewhat with the lime green of the Digital Good Network. So we need to work on that for next time. I'd just like to welcome you all on behalf of the Sheffield Economic and Social Research Council Festival of Social Sciences 2023. So the festival, it runs for 4 weeks. We have over 25 events happening involving over 35 academics at the University of Sheffield and Sheffield Hallam University. There'll be a link in the chat where you can find out more about the festival. We've got events taking place until the 17th of November, so it would be great to see you at some of those. Some of those are hybrid and online events as well. We've got exhibitions, we've got talks, we've got workshops, so please do get involved. There's some print programmes just on the way out as well, if you'd like to take one of those with you. And if I could also ask, and I feel such a pain, but if you could please complete an evaluation of the event as well. There'll be a link online and there's some postcards as well. It's just really useful for our funders to find out what our audiences are enjoying. So thank you all, have a wonderful evening, and I'll hand back over to Helen.
Thank you very much, Jenny. So we have 3 panelists who are experts in the topic of this event, digital technologies, mental health and well-being. They're going to talk for a maximum of 15 minutes each. I'm going to then kind of link what they say to our interest in the Digital Good Network, and then we will open it up for question and answer, and we will be finished by 7:30 at the latest. So I'm going to hand over to our first speaker, who is Neil Coulson from the University of Nottingham.
There we go. I just wanted to start with a bit of context. And really just thinking about those times in our life where we perhaps don't feel particularly well, whether we're talking about a common cold, something sort of physical like that, or in our heads, we feel a bit low, we feel a bit down, maybe a bit anxious, stressed, that type of thing. And it's very natural for us to ask questions. We try to make sense of what's happening to us. We know this from our sort of psychology, our investigations of how people deal with and respond to signs and perceptions of illness. And on this slide, you'll just see some of the questions one might have. I was just reflecting on the last time I was ill, and I was thinking, what went through my head? And usually I go, is this serious? I'm a bit of a hypochondriac, so I want to know, is this serious? And next I think, well, what's actually caused this? What's underpinning this? Is it going to go away? Is it going to last a long time? So lots of different questions can really be sort of floating in our minds when we're experiencing these troublesome times. Oh gosh, no, it's gone. I just want to ignore that. But the point I'm trying to make is that in the past, we might only speak to friends, family, colleagues, but now we can actually go online. And we know that many people go online to search for health information. But in doing that, I'm just going to ignore that now. But in doing that and searching and Googling, which we've probably all done about our health, one might find online peer support communities. So we've known about these communities. I'll explain a little bit more about them in a moment. For about 2 decades now. The first time I really saw this written about was by a North American scientist, Gunther Eisenbach, who put forward a really nice definition, and I think it just draws out all the key points that we want to make. This is about a group, a community of individuals who have something in common, and that's usually around health or illness, but something that binds them together of mutual interest. And it's typically a group or community of non-professionals. It could just be patients, it could be caregivers, and through computer communication networks, such as the internet, these communities can start to thrive. So when faced with the challenges of health and illness, whether it be physical or mental health, one can, through Google, either accidentally or perhaps deliberately search for and find these online support communities. So these online communities, there's probably a number of key things I think is really worth sort of flagging. There's lots of different platforms that could underpin that. So what I mean by that is simply we could have chat rooms where you're quickly typing and somebody else is replying and you can see messages very rapidly being posted. Or maybe it's something like a Facebook group. We're probably all members of Facebook, and maybe we're even members of a Facebook group for some health-related purpose. Or it could be a bulletin board where you post a message and then maybe a few hours later somebody will reply. Or maybe it's something like Skype or Zoom. You can see how Zoom works this evening. So these online peer support communities have become big business. And I use that word deliberately because there's many platforms now. Health Unlock, for example, is a really important platform. There we go. So many people are using them. It's hard to actually quantify just how many, but there are tens of thousands of these online communities. So really, the number of people who use them is probably quite mind-blowing. But what actually drives them? What's the reasons that so many people are going online, talking to probably complete strangers about intimate, sensitive, personal mental health? Well, there's a whole convenience factor, I think. You know, if you're digitally connected, you're not sleeping, perhaps you're worrying in the middle of the night, you can switch on the iPhone, you can actually access support at any time of the day or night, provided you're connected. But beyond convenience, there's a real sort of anonymity factor here, where people can choose to disclose information if they wish. And we know from interview studies, from surveys, that many people who participate in these communities really welcome the opportunity to control what is being put out there online. So there's a real sort of convenience factor, I think, but often we're talking about experiences of illness where maybe they don't know anybody else in their own, face-to-face network. It's quite a difficult thing to say, I think I've got depression, does anybody else have that? You don't really have that conversation. So maybe you feel embarrassed, maybe it's very stigmatized, maybe you just don't know anybody who perhaps has, or what you think you've got. So there's a real sort of resonance there in terms of the ability to connect to other people. Three key things. One, they allow you to connect. Two, they allow you to explore. Three, they allow you to narrate. So connecting to others, similar others, is incredibly powerful. Finding someone just like me can be an incredibly powerful thing to realise, and I'll come on to talk about that in a second. To explore, to learn about topics, and to narrate or to share your story. And these are a number of ways in which people who participate tell us is actually important. So what difference does any of this make? There is no sort of order to this diagram. These are just some of the sort of benefits that people report that I think are perhaps relevant to the mental health space. Social support I've mentioned, but one of the most immediate benefits people tell us they experience when joining an online support group is they feel less isolated. It's good to know there's others just like me, and that's a very, very quick benefit that people start to realise if they perhaps have felt alone and isolated. They report being able to cope better, improve mood, reduce anxiety, reduce distress, feeling more empowered, able to do things, perhaps more confident, talking to the doctors or healthcare professionals or mental health specialists, and feeling a sense of belonging to something, and we're all in this together. People often use language about being in the same boat as each other. So a range of sort of benefits, but it's not all good. There are some problems, And again, there are several problems, to be fair, but I just wanted to flag a couple. One, reading about negative experiences. Most of these online communities, people participate through textual conversations. They will post messages. Often they're narrating their illness experience. They're telling everybody who's listening virtually about what they've gone through. That can actually be really, really quite distressing when you're reading about other people's experiences. Perhaps they're further down in their journey, further along that road, and you didn't realise this might happen, that might happen. That can actually be quite overwhelming. So reading about others' negative experiences can be a problem. The other example, which is often picked up, is that anything in these spaces has to be wrong because it's just all going to be medically inaccurate and not helpful. It's actually a really difficult thing to really kind of quantify the extent of the problem. Many of these online communities will have active moderators, administrators, volunteers who will sift through messages and strip out anything that's actually really problematic. So the extent of the problem is perhaps not as bad as we think, but you have to still be careful. And my advice would be to only participate in moderated communities. So last 30 seconds, key take-home messages. What have we learned from the studies we've undertaken when we've had focus groups, we've had interviews, we've had surveys, we've analysed the messages that have been sent. These communities are accessible, they're convenient, and anonymity might be quite a powerful factor. It can help individuals in many different ways, and the sort of circular diagram illustrated that. They're not without their problem. I've just flagged two potential issues. And I would probably finish by saying I think they're an underexploited resource. So if we think about our NHS and the challenges of supporting people with mental health issues, then maybe there is some potential in online peer support communities. But how we actually integrate that into our healthcare system is a really, really challenging topic. So conscious of time, I don't want to steal anybody else's, so thank you for listening. I'm very grateful. Actually, come up under time. That's a first.
Thank you so much, Neil. Interesting framing of a lot of the benefits and some of the concerns around the ways that digital technologies might relate to mental health and well-being, and provides a really great framing for the rest of the session. Hoping that we still have some people online. There are clearly some challenges going on there, which our fantastic team in Technology Corner are trying to resolve. But if there are people online and you do have any questions, we'll save them for the Q&A at the end. And if you can use the Q&A function on Zoom, we'll pick them up there. Please don't use the chat function because it can be hard to monitor both functions. So we're going to be looking at questions that come in the Q&A function. So, as I said, really great framing from Neil about what some of the opportunities and challenges are. And I hope that we are now going to hear from Isabel Higgins, who is from the ESRC Digital Good Network and the University of Sheffield. And she is going to talk about a particular way that she's been looking into wellness, well-being and digital technology with her collaborator, Dr. Jonathan Ong. She is at the University of Sheffield, but she's in the US at the moment doing some research, and that's why she's joining us digitally. Hi, Isabel. Hi, Isabel.
Hi, Helen. Can you hear me? Can you see me?
We can see and hear you. Welcome.
Great. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I'm sad not to be there in person, but it's lovely to be able to connect like this. Thank you to the tech team for organising and sorting out those initial glitches. Great. So I am going to talk about the project that Dr. Jonathan Corpus-Ong and I are working on, which is exploring the links between digital wellness and online disinformation. So this phrase has been kind of circulating over the last, I would say, since mid-2021. I wonder if some of you have probably already heard of people referring to the wellness to QAnon pipeline. So this is kind of a construction that's being used by journalists, by pop culture commentators, and by news outlets to talk about these slippery interconnections between people who go online, who tend to be women, to look at wellness or alternative health content. So maybe things like essential oils, tarot cards, ADHD, kind of approaches to ADHD for their children that are non-medication. And from these online spaces, there seems to be a massive overlap with conspiratorial beliefs and practices. So beliefs that there's a group of people controlling the world, a secret group of people controlling the world, and then an overlap between that group and the group that's kind of QAnon, Donald Trump adjacent, and often actual fascism, racism, right-wing propaganda. So Jonathan and I are doing a project that aims to look at this idea of the wellness to QAnon pipeline, which is now a way that this kind of social phenomena is being reported, and ask what it shows us about what's going on online, and also ask what it's missing and what else we could bring to this understanding. And I should say that we're focusing our project on the US because Jonathan is based in the US, and my PhD research looked at the adoption of children in the USA. So I'm very familiar with online US spaces. And Jonathan and I have both done research into very different online communities. So Jonathan has looked at people of colour in wellness spaces who often use alternative modes of kind of connecting and finding healing to cope with various types of trauma that are often racialized. And I've spent quite a bit of time looking at white women in far right spaces who use the idea of the child and talk about their children as a way to radicalize and encourage other mothers to do some of the same things, such as taking their children out of mainstream school, not having them vaccinated, and in worst case scenarios, buying and carrying guns on a daily basis. So Jonathan and I came to this project with two very different empirical cases, but when we brought them together, we realized that in different ways, both of our work complicated this idea of the wellness to QAnon pipeline, which is what I'm showing in these images here. So, and as we can see, these images are from mainstream media outlets, The Guardian, the BBC, and Harper's Bazaar. So 3 things that we have been questioning then through our empirical work. In the first instance, we're interested in asking questions about social context. So we want to ask, in what context do people become interested in wellness, conspiracy, and the far right? And here you can see a timeline that I've been working on over the last month. So you can't see it in detail, and that's fine. But what I'm trying, I've included it here because what I want to show is that on the top half of the timeline, I've plotted a lot of relevant political, social, health events that happened in the US from 2020, January 2020 to where we are now, October 2023. And alongside the bottom half of the timeline, we're populating it with news media coverage about the links between the wellness to QAnon pipeline, as well as stuff created by, like material created by academics and by people in conspiracy, far right and wellness communities themselves. So what we're trying to do here is bring everything together so that we're placing the existence of this kind of content of people who believe in anti-vaccination, for example, in context. So if we think about the anti-vax movement, we can think about how it existed pre to the COVID-19 pandemic, but how the pandemic itself was a social moment in which these kind of ideas were getting a lot more currency as people were starting to understand the centrality of vaccinations to normal, quote unquote, normal everyday life opening up. So in the first instance, what we're trying to do with this project then is not to say that these individual people have fallen down these rabbit holes and become radicalized and become conspiracists. Instead, we're asking, in what context has this happened? Why do people come to this content in the first place? And what might affect their engagement with it? Secondly, we are asking about situated histories and identities, which Jonathan put really nicely. He said, why do people believe the things that they do? And I think this is a really, really helpful question to ask when we're thinking about kind of what context do people live in, what has happened previously in their lives, and what has happened historically in the place that they live, and how is that shaped by who they are? So writing in a really different context, Susan Lepselter writes about the belief in UFO narratives in the 1990s in the US, and she asks, what happens when you listen to people talk about UFOs ethnographically? Then you hear many kinds of stories and silences, all filled with multiple layered senses of being abducted or caught and multiple dreams of release. These are stories filled with interconnecting imaginaries of injury and redemption. The stories here are the real objects. They are performative, a form of verbal art. So here, what Lepselter is doing really, really cleverly, I think, is connecting this idea of people's belief in UFOs in the 1990s to much longer histories in the US of chattel enslavement and settler colonialism, in which people quite literally being abducted or caught and sold and trying to find freedom are shaping, on some levels, the kind of cultural narratives that they're creating to express their experiences in the present. And in a similar way, I think it's really helpful to think about the conspiracy theories that we're seeing now online, especially those that are anti-vax or talking about saving children, for example, and thinking about the histories that feed into them and how people's own personal histories as well as collective social histories might shape the things that they find attractive to believe in, or might shape the stories that they want to tell. And the other thing that we're trying to do to complicate this idea of the wellness to QAnon pipeline is to remember that this wellness to QAnon pipeline is happening on and through digital technology. So you can think about how digital technology, and specifically social media, how it's designed and how it's used to try and understand how digital tech and how the conspiracy, far-right wellness overlaps happen. So again, Jonathan asked this very simple question: how is social media used for information warfare? And I think it's really important here to not be techno-deterministic. So not to say that social media is the cause of the wellness to QAnon pipeline, for example, but to recognize that the affordances, so what we can do on social media, how it's designed and what it prioritizes. So for example, often social media platforms prioritize user engagement, so users staying on the platform for as long as possible. That might help us understand the kind of content that is attractive and appealing to audiences. So maybe it's content with a high shock value, or explains to them something that they have taken for granted about their everyday lives. So in this book, Meme Wars, these three researchers, all based in the US, talk about how online memes from the far right have circulated and have led to social events such as the Capitol insurrection, so the storming of the US Capitol in 2021. And they say the internet did not cause the insurrection, but it enabled it. The technology of every age in human history shapes the culture of that time. So taking this as the starting point, then in our project, we're really trying to ask, what kind of cultures are being shaped by the technologies offered to us by the digital and by social media, and how do we think about that alongside the other two things I've just talked about, identities and histories and wider social context, right? So how do we place our engagement with digital technology and the design of that digital technology into a wider contextual frame? So to bring all these things together, then I just want to end by briefly talking about an example from my research. So here we have 4 screenshots from social media. So as context for my research, one of the things I do is follow online women, tend to be white women in the US who've adopted children of color and then make their careers out of being social media influencers. So I follow 74 of these women on Instagram, and all of these women have followers in the hundreds of thousands. And over the last 3 years, my PhD project was to look at the kind of content that these women are creating and consuming and how it affects the care for their children. And so I want to make it very clear that none of these women, none of these adoptive parents are the women whose screenshots I'm using in this slide. These screenshots are from a slightly different online community. But I start with that preamble because I first became aware of this slippery kind of relationship between wellness, conspiracy, and the far right through my research into adoptive parents. So this first screenshot on the left, for example, is an account followed by a number of the adoptive women. that offers some reasons why white women specifically, as you can see in the image there, might be feeling unwell. So in here, she was really being paid attention to as a number of things that we might take for granted, that are all connected back, in this case, to the idea of heavy metals causing sickness. So we can see here how something that might seem like information can potentially be read as a form of misinformation, right? Incorrect health information. And so moving from that account and looking at the accounts that this first social media influencer followed, I quickly found myself in like engaging with a range of social media content that becomes more and more disinformed and ultimately incites women to violence. So we're moving here from warning women not to carry heavy metals, not to wear heavy metals or be near them. This one encouraging women to raise their girls and boys differently if they're mothers, encouraging them to take their girls out of mainstream school, for example, prepare them for careers that they can do alongside being mothers, and also embodying kind of what we might call traditional feminine values. Moving on to the third screenshot here, this is created by an evangelical Christian woman who follows the person in the preceding screenshot, and this is encouragement for women. This is a flowchart, and I'm sure lots of people with social media have seen these flowcharts about various things, but this is a flowchart about whether or not you should talk to anyone apart from your husband about something going on in your personal life. And the advice here is, have you asked your husband about it? If the answer is no, ask your husband first. And if he needs to approve of you asking another woman's opinion before you can go right ahead, right? So can we see here how there's this movement for increasing kind of what I would term radicalization or closeness to violence, or at least gender inequality, and then moving over to a place I'm currently exploring on the internet, in which many women encourage other women to carry guns, but doing what's called concealed, it's not being carried. So here we can see, be honest, did you notice my gun? Hint, I'm wearing a Glock 43 in a Betty 2.0. And Betty 2.0 is a kind of holster that I think this woman is wearing around her middle. So I think the gun is between her breasts, actually. And that this is kind of an advertisement for that holster, for that gun. So what's so interesting here is that it would be very easy to fall into sensationalism and talk about this wellness to QAnon pipeline and how terrifying it is. But what I'm really interested in is thinking about these long histories of racial inequality in the US, of this idea of white womanhood embodying purity and a desire to white women putting forward a desire to protect themselves from a racialized other, and that being kind of justification for a number of beliefs and behaviors and practices. So in summary then, what we're trying to do with this project is to remember the importance of complexity and to encourage others talking about this wellness to QAnon pipeline to engage with that complexity in their work. And there are some really, really good examples of this. Here are two. This is from a journalist who's encouraging others to talk about accidental conspiracies. So your neighbor, your aunt, someone, a friend from your son's football team's parents who now believe in these things. How do we talk about those? And this second article at the bottom here is written for children who are teenagers or young adults whose parents have become kind of part of this QAnon conspiracy. So there are some really great examples, we think, of journalists and political commentators and social commentators kind of humanizing and bringing to the fore the complexity of this situation. And what we hope to add to it is remembering the histories, identities of people involved in this content, and also people's capacity and agency, so people's capacity to behave and make choices about their lives, whilst also remembering social inequalities that might lead people to search out certain types of material online, as well as the design and use of technology and the prioritization of social media platforms to make profit through personalization of what we see online. And that's it. I hope that has contributed to the discussion. And as I said, I'm sorry I'm not there in person, but thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Isabel. That was really brilliant and a very different take on the way that mental health, well-being, wellness gets packaged up in digital form, drawing our attention to the fact that platforms, digital technologies are not neutral windows without sort of blaming those platforms as well. We are now going to hear from Dr. Isabel Gerard, who is my colleague in the Department of Sociological Studies at the University of Sheffield, who I think will probably, hopefully, bring those two talk together somewhat in some of the things she'll tell us about her research. Over to you, Isabel. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And just to say thank you so much for the kind invitation to be here. Thank you for everyone working the event and making it run so smoothly. I'm ever so grateful. So my name is Isabel Gerard. As Helen says, I'm a senior lecturer in digital communication in the Department of Sociological Studies at the University of Sheffield. In terms of a description of myself, it's really hard, isn't it? I've got medium length brown hair highlighted blonde. I'm a white cisgender woman. I'm wearing a pink jumper. It's quite long with black tights and children's black Doc Marten boots. So for my research, I'm on kind of a hybrid research and teaching contract at the university. For the research side of things, I'm really interested in researching young and or vulnerable people's uses of social media platforms. And so what that means is that I'm often called upon by the press, by policymakers, and by platforms themselves, and then also just people in my life, to comment on what I think the harmful, scary things are about social media. It might be a new app, it might be a feature within a technology, it might be a prediction about technology, it might be loads of different things, but I'm often called upon to talk specifically about the harms. This is something I've noticed over the last few years is, why is this scary? What is this going to do? And so my most recent research has centered on young people's identity negotiations in a range of spaces. So they might be anonymous apps. So these are apps that allow you to send messages to people without saying who you are. So two app users, like I could send Helen an app if she was an app user. I could send her a message and she wouldn't know I had sent it, but I would know who I was sending it to. These are really popular with kids. And then I've also conducted a pilot project based on how teenagers feel about digital photo editing, specifically of the face and body. So all of my research is really focused on harms and kind of experiences of things like bullying and social comparison. All these things inevitably come up in the research. But over the last few years, so I'm working on a book at the moment. I'm compiling all of that into a book. And one of the things that I've learned over the last few years and through kind of my career so far, listening to people like Helen, like Nancy Baim, among many other people who have written extensively about the internet since its inception. So I'm someone who's become quite hesitant to do four things when I answer these questions about harms plus social media plus young people. I'm very hesitant to say that something is new when it isn't. This can be annoying. So a policymaker, when they say, okay, what do you think about this? What should we do about this? They don't want you to be like, well, it's just like TV. It's just like the newspaper. They don't want you to say that. So that's a bit jarring. That's a bit of a tension. But I think it's important to learn from the past. I've become fairly resistant. I'm still practicing this, but I've really become quite resistant to using just the phrase social media as a catch-all to describe everything, because they are so diverse now. They're diverse in their makeup, they're diverse in their use, and it just has started to feel a bit wrong. But that's really hard because it's an easy shorthand for us. I've become very resistant to framing every worry as a moral panic. So I've been doing a lot of thinking and learning about moral panic theory and recognizing where something is actually just a worry. It's not a full-blown moral panic, but we often see this phrase used in response to any new concern about kids and social media. And actually, sometimes those worries themselves are justified, and I don't want to just kind of get rid of them. And really what is actually the ethos of the network is that I've become really resistant to framing technologies and their uses as either good or bad. This is something I'm really committed to, and actually what I'm trying to, it's an idea I'm kind of trying to intervene in through my work. So what I'm going to do today is to show one way that we might be able to break down this really common social dichotomy. So as I say, I'm currently preparing my first book, which combines 3 projects on anonymous apps, digital photo editing, and also how people talk about mental health across social media platforms. So some really strong resonances there. And what I'm working on as the book's central contribution to knowledge is this concept of what I call platform paradoxes as a route into understanding how young people use and experience social media. So, in 1998, California said that basically young people negotiate their identities across platforms in highly paradoxical ways. So what they say is that when young people use social media, often paradoxical experiences can occur at the same time, or at least be potentiated in exactly the same thing. So what we mean by this is that as I spoke to more and more young people through my research, I soon realized that it wasn't enough to describe their experiences of a given app as good or bad. I kind of went into it knowing that already, so that really didn't come as a surprise. But as I kept going and kept thinking over years and years, I realized that it also wasn't enough to say, oh, they can be both good and bad, and sometimes they're good and sometimes they're bad, and it's complicated. And Dana Boyd wrote a really brilliant book in 2014 called It's Complicated. I think it was the Network Lives of something teens. Yeah, something like that. And it is a really powerful, kind of field defining in a lot of ways book. But no offense to Dana, but I do think we need to move a little bit beyond just saying it's complicated now, because that complication, complexity, I think can take a really specific form. So what I'm going to do is give you 3 examples of how paradoxically technologies can be experienced as both good and bad, often at the same time. And indeed for young people specifically, especially the ones in my study, sometimes it's only by accepting and facing the risks can you unlock pleasures and rewards. Sometimes you have to have one in order to have the other, and I don't think that many of the current ways that we talk about young people in social media can accommodate that. And I think it's a difficult concept to get our heads around, but it is a lived reality of today's young people. So this is an example of an anonymous app. So this is a bit of a summary, I would say, of how most of the young people in my research felt about them. So they felt connected to their peers through anonymous apps while also being bullied. Not by them, but through them. So what a lot of young people were saying is anonymous apps are really risky. Like downloading one, you don't know what people are going to say to you. It is an innate risk. The point of the apps is to be risky. But actually they wanted to be part of something bigger, especially when an app took off and was really popular around a school. They worked really well in school-based settings. And they would sit there and say, like, I really hate this app, I don't want it, but they want it. They download it, they use it, and you've kind of got this really contradictory thing where both things are true at the same time, and you can't, and we probably shouldn't try to separate them. So this was, it was a pilot study, so it had a smaller number of qualitative participants than the anonymous apps research. But what has started to emerge through this work that I really hope to grow is the sense that editing pictures of your face and body can bring you self-confidence while also making you feel bad about yourself. This was something that all of the participants I spoke to kind of said, where actually using an app to change your appearance, either in, a subtle or a more extreme way, it does make you feel good in the moment. You like the picture you see, you like what you've edited, you like what it looks like. But at the same time, they said, oh, but I don't look like that. And they had this reality in the back of their mind. But both things were happening at exactly the same time. And again, it didn't feel wise to separate them out to kind of help their experiences. It made more sense to me to try to understand those things together. And so this is from my mental health hashtag research. So I've done a couple of projects relating to this, but one of them was with Professor Anthony McCosker, who's at Swinburne University, and we explored how people talk about depression within the hashtag depressed on Instagram. And one of the things we found, so the sentiment was very much posting to mental health hashtags can make me feel like I'm not alone, while also feeding me content that makes me feel worse. So you're participating in this hashtag, you're posting content, and you're navigating social media, especially apps that simultaneously recommend content to you instead of it being sort of chronologically organized. You're doing this thing that is making you feel better, it's making you feel good. But actually, then you scroll down a bit and then there's something there which makes you feel bad. But again, both things are happening at once, and the people in this research and all the research I've done, they have to take that risk of seeing that bad thing to unlock the potential benefits of the other good. I said I wasn't used up it. The potential good things that might be there. So just some kind of wrapping up. Paying attention to paradoxes, of course, deters us from attending to either or outcomes of technological use. These categories are overly broad, and this is something that both of our speakers have said, and it's part of, I think, the ethos of the event. And again, as I say, this marks a shift away from thinking about the relationship between social media and young people as complicated, which it is. It is complicated, and I'm not trying to say that it isn't. But actually, this complexity, I think, seems to, in some cases, not all, be taking a really particular form that I think we need to attend to a little bit more. And just some kind of concluding thoughts. So to sum across all the young people I've spoken to, I've noticed it is sometimes, again, only by doing something risky or even downright objectively harmful on social media that pleasure and enjoyment can be activated or achieved. But I am, of course, not the first person to talk about the paradoxical nature of people's experiences of social media. So there are a few examples, but Oliver Hameson and other colleagues, they interviewed social media users who had recently experienced major life transitions. And they identified this really interesting, they called it an online authenticity paradox, where they say people strive to achieve online authenticity, yet because doing so requires sharing negative experiences on social media, online authenticity is actually unreachable, or it's only possible at a great personal cost. But where I'm trying to shift this thinking towards platform paradoxes, not just paradoxical experiences, but platform paradoxes, is that in the examples I've discussed and in many others, the rules and regulations of social media platforms are inherently tied into what young people feel they can do, what they are doing, and how what they do is talked about, especially in the UK, where we've got a lot of kind of governmental intervention into online harms. I'm under no illusion that attending to paradoxes will be easy. It won't be easy for policymakers, tech workers, and so on. And nor am I again implying that we shouldn't be worried about certain things. This isn't intended to be dismissive. But I do feel that attending to paradoxes is necessary to breathe empirical depth and critical life into our understandings of the realities of young lives online. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Isabel. That was really fantastic and did such a great job of speaking to the things that we're interested in the Digital Good Network and moving across the many things I think that the other speakers also spoke about. So I'm just going to speak for maybe, I don't know, 5 minutes or so, just to try to situate what you've heard from Neil and the two Isabels with differently spelt names before opening it out to a Q&A and sort of highlight some of the things that they've said, refer back to them by talking about the relationship between digital tech, mental health and well-being, and this notion of the digital good or a good digital society. So one of the things that Isabel with the Y said was that digital technologies are not all the same. Social media are not all the same. apps are not all the same, devices are not all the same. So we have to be sort of specific if we want to make claims about paradoxes, benefits, harms, advantages, disadvantages, good and bad. So I have an example of dating apps up here. And I put this up here because I think there are special sort of issues around mental health and well-being with dating apps. I think it's a really good example of the very different layers of the kind of paradoxes that Isabel was talking about. So, you know, you could meet a future lifelong romantic partner on a dating app. You can, you know, enable romantic connections. You can overcome feelings of loneliness. You can have an intimate relationship. But I don't know if anyone saw the feature in The Guardian at the weekend, which was about the death of the dating app, people moving away from dating apps. So some of it was about things like, you know, dealing with fake accounts or dealing with the effects of judgments that are made on you superficially on the basis of a couple of pictures and a couple of words, but also much more serious things like abuse, people with disabilities, or sexualized racism, which people have claimed takes place on there. And that's not to start talking about the amount of data that dating apps gather about us. You can see this article here, which is many years old, it's several years old, but through a freedom of information request, a journalist asked Tinder for information and got an 800-page document. So there's all sorts of layers going on with something as specific as dating apps. So I really think that's come out in the presentations so far. So why do we talk about the digital good on the Digital Good Network? I'll just talk a little bit about how we came to be called the Digital Good Network, which is another version of the story you told, really, Isabel, about being asked to comment on harms. So there is an emphasis on harms. There has been an emphasis on harms. The online safety bill is about harms. So I had a couple of researchers from the University of Sussex several years ago now looked at policy statements about digital literacy. Digital literacy was equated with knowing how to avoid harms. Lots and lots of social research, social science research has focused on harms. So some examples here, a book that you can see called Automating Inequality looks at how high-tech tools profile, police and punish the poor. So how prejudices are written into systems. So a child is seen to be at risk if they have not got very warm clothes or live in a cold house. That's seen as a proxy for risk of abuse. But actually, those are the conditions of poverty. So assumptions about risk get written into systems. And then we see on this side here a very famous piece of journalism from 2016 called Machine Bias, which was about the way that prejudice is written into criminal justice systems in the UK. So a machine takes two people who have committed small, minor crimes, and on the basis of racial prejudice written into that machine, the black woman is seen to be more at risk of future crime, so is given a harsher sentence than the white man. So, as Isabel said, all this research is really important. Surfacing harms has been really important. Thinking about those things is really important. But what kind of digital world do we want? What kind of digital society do we want to live in? We note that the concept good, four-letter word, really simple sounding little four-letter word, is really complicated. Different people will understand what good means in different ways, have different understandings of it, based on some of the things that Isabel Higgins was talking about, people's histories, their social location, their identity, and so on. There are lots of different technologies and different tech applications. So we have to ask things like how, when, and where might digital technologies be seen as good? And good for whom? What's good for one person is not good for another person, and social inequalities really play into this, as we saw in the examples I just gave. So we want to avoid, we want to think about what does a good digital society look like, but we want to avoid what might be called techno-solutionism, right? This idea that a digital technology can provide us with a good society. That is too simplistic because of all the different layers that we've heard about from Neil, from Isabel Higgins, from Isabel Gerard, all these different layers. It's too simple to think a technology can solve a social problem. And then there's all different disciplines come at these things in really different ways. In the italics in the top corner there, you can see, philosophy has historically had a lot to say about what a good society looks like. More applied areas like computing ethics, they exist to think about what should and shouldn't be built. And then policymakers, practitioners, civil society folk, advocates, activists, technology users, who Isabel's spoken to, ordinary people, whoever that complicated group is, will all have sort of different views. And I put in the bottom here, this is a headline from an article in Nature, which says, it's talking about artificial intelligence, and it says, don't ask if artificial intelligence is good or fair, ask how it shifts power. So you get these criticisms of the term good as kind of emptying out the politics of digital technologies and their uses, right? It's not political enough. We shouldn't be talking about good or fair. We should be talking about power and how we change power. So loads of work about harms. Good is really complicated, but we're hugely influenced by this quote by a US-based sociologist called Rua Benjamin, who says, remember to imagine and craft the worlds you cannot live without, just as you dismantle the ones you cannot live within. So she's saying, okay, yeah, let's know what the harms are. Let's think about how we might address those harms, and then let's think about what we want to replace it with, what kind of world we want to replace it with. So I gave a talk at a working men's club in Sheffield a couple of weeks ago, and I was asked the best questions about how we could possibly be putting good and digital together, given all the harms, especially to young people, a younger generation seen by this particular person as extremely kind of alienated in digital times. Who is listening to you? What is the point of doing all of this unless the right people are listening to what you have to say? But for us, in a way, it's an experiment. Does talking about a good digital society get people around the table? Does it get people from these different disciplines, these different sectors together, thinking about what a good digital society looks like? So that's our question. It's 5 years, a big investment from one of the research funders. What does a good digital society look like, and how do we get there? It's a very big question. So we're trying to to give us a bit of a focus, to get us started. We say in our group, 3 things matter. One of them is resilience, which includes what we've been talking about today, mental health, well-being, wellness, and so on. One of them is equity. We've seen again today different ways that sort of social inequalities might affect our understanding of what a good digital society looks like. And the other is sustainability. The world is on fire or underwater. How do we use digital technologies in ways that sustain the planet as we move forward? So some of us are doing research. There's some people in the room from the Digital Good Network here, and hopefully you'll speak in the Q&A. And we're also funding some research projects. So a couple of examples on this slide. So Abby Millings from the network, who's at the back there, does research on digital technologies and intimate relationships. So some of us, Roz, haven't we? We've learned what phubbing means through engaging with Abby on the network, phone snubbing. So snubbing people who you're with because you're on your phone. How does that impact relational resilience and related well-being? And then on the other things you can see on this slide are some of the projects that we're funding. So the first one is about how text messaging matters as an act of everyday human goodness or kindness. Take something really, really everyday. The next one listens to children's voices, so talks to children from disadvantaged communities in Bradford, so looking at kind of questions of equity. The final one looks at, what does good use of digital tech look like in a low resource health setting in Africa, for example. So different ways that we're kind of bringing together those themes. And I'm okay with us not getting there. Personally, I don't know what the funder would say to that, but I think what's important is the journey of bringing disciplines together, different actors and stakeholders together, exploring together, surfacing our differences, coming to impasses sometimes maybe, but thinking through together this idea, this question of what a good digital society might look like. And so it's in that context that we bring Isabel and Neil together to ask questions about the nature of the relationship between digital technologies, mental health and well-being. And so I've kept perfectly to time. It's 7 o'clock, so we can now turn to questions, answers, comments, observations, strongly voiced disagreement from the audience in the room and also from folks online. So I will chair. Unfortunately, Isabel Higgins is not with us for the Q&A because this is the 1 week of the year where it's not 5 hours behind in the US, it's 4 hours behind because our clocks fell back and theirs don't fall back to next weekend. So unfortunately, she had an overlapping meeting. She timed everything perfectly and then the clocks moved. But some of us are familiar with her research. We can probably talk about it, but she also welcomes any follow-up questions that people might have via email. So we have a hand up. Please could you say who you are so that we know who we're talking to. Yeah.
Sure. Hello everyone. My name is Kath. We live in Hillsborough. Hardly ever come into the city centre, so this is fantastic and exciting and a really super evening, so thank you. I'm old enough to remember a life before the internet and before phones. So when I was at work, this isn't a question by the way, it's just a comment. When I was at work, I had to go on a workshop to learn how to send an email, which is mad. And so even though I remember a life before phones, I think I'm going to admit now, my partner already knows, that I seem to be addicted to Instagram. So the first time I'm going to admit that. And I thought it was fine because I was looking at crafting things, making things out of recycled material, toilet roll middles, foraging, things like that. I thought that was fine. I wasn't falling into any QAnon rabbit holes until suddenly, so I identify as a hedge witch, and suddenly I saw a post of a hedge witch, single woman, young, attractive, living in a van, off-grid, chopping her own wood, and suddenly I saw all of these comments. So Isabel was something like, all these comments about how she's going to end up unmarried, childless, how she's destroying society by following her own path. And I suddenly thought, this is problematic. I am addicted, and this is problematic.
So the comments from followers,
Yes,
that was troubling.
yes,
Yeah. Don't know if anyone wants to say anything. I know you've looked at followers on Instagram, haven't you, Isabel? You want to say anything?
I think one of the things that stood out to me about what you said, so there's a lot of research on kind of digital media addiction, and then there's the whole like digital detox movement, whatever you want to call it now, where people try and kind of break away from certain apps or certain devices. And I wanted to respond with a question, actually, if that's all right. I wondered, so that word like addiction, I just wondered why addiction? Because it sort of, for me, it has all these kind of negative connotations. And at what point did you think, okay, I'm just using Instagram to now I'm addicted to Instagram? I'm just really curious.
Yeah, sure. So we don't have a television, and I think I'm cool because we don't have television. And I don't know why, my partner asked me to. We asked the phone to tell me how long I'm on the phone. I'm on the phone for longer than I ever would have been watching television.
I wonder if, I know there's some psychologists in the room. Do you have anything to say about addiction? About addiction, not to therapy you, but from a sort of research point of view, the concept of addiction. I think you're suggesting, I think you're sort of implicitly questioning where the boundaries are.
Yeah.
Around use and addiction, and obviously relationship to mental health and well-being. Does anyone want to comment on that?
I think I would just sort of endorse what's just been said by Isabel, in as much as listen to you, you know, share your story. Addiction always has this kind of negative connotation, but you could have easily have said, "Oh, I am a heavy user of Instagram," but the language that you chose was one of addiction and possibly a negative interpretation. So it suggests perhaps you're viewing your actions as something that is taking away from or detracting from something else, that's compromising something else in life. And is that how you feel? Do you think that, do you perceive a negative consequence?
I'm looking at so many crafters crafting that I'm not crafting. I don't have time to craft. But I'm not crafting.
And something else that links back to some of your earlier research, Isabel, is, you know, if I understand it, you were quite interested in derision, right? About how some uses of some technologies are derided. So people maybe see them as a guilty secret or feel embarrassed about them. And I wonder if that plays into it a little bit. Is it something that we, you know, excessive social media use is something we should be embarrassed about because it's derided, and therefore we need to frame it in sort of extreme terms?
Yeah, one of the things I did, so this was sort of my PhD research, I was really interested in, it's really convoluted, but adults who were fans of TV shows that were meant for teens, and how they kind of sort of concealed aspects of their identity to participate in sort of their guilty pleasures. And I didn't, as a PhD student, I didn't do a lot with the concept of sort of guilt and pleasure, but now I look back, I really wish I had, because I feel like a lot of I think our identities and our social norms play so much into what is considered acceptable and what isn't. So I think gender is one of them, and I wonder if, would we say we were addicted to books, you know, sort of prestigious, whatever you want to call them, sort of fiction books that, you know, 50 books through before you die type books. Would we say we were addicted to reading books in a way? Oh, I've read too many books, so I'm not writing enough, but because I'm reading too much. And I just, I don't know, I'm just wondering how much of what you're saying is actually tied up with just societal norms, and I just find it really fascinating. So thank you for sharing.
Neil, does it come up in your research, like too much use of online health communities?
When I first started to look at online communities, so this has gone back to 2003, and you look at the literature then, one of the first things that I discovered was the kind of anti-internet literature, as in, you know, you spend too much time online, therefore you're not interacting with people in your real network, that type of thing. The other thing was around, you know, addiction, that you just can't put it down, you know, whatever device you're using back then, it was fairly limited. So it was there, but I didn't really then see it play out in the research. You know, whenever we've run studies speaking to users of online communities, seldom does anybody say I was addicted to, you know, reading messages or posting messages. And maybe it just doesn't exist, or maybe it's around the language that we use. So in my world of online peer support communities, I wouldn't necessarily say somebody was addicted, but we do classify some people as what we call super users. So they spend a lot of their day and week doing this thing of reading and posting and answering and connecting, and that's become almost not even a hobby, it's become a lifestyle, it's become their job in a sense. So it's a really interesting thing to think about addiction, because it doesn't necessarily resonate, but I do see users who are very, very, very present day in, day out, day in, day out, but they themselves would not describe themselves as addicted when we've spoken to them. So.
It does show the sort of shifting understandings of like a good amount of use, too much use. Your super users are super, they're not addicted. Any other, hello, please tell us who you are.
Hi, I'm Victoria and I'm doing my PhD at University of Sheffield, and my research is about mental health service for the international student at the UK higher education. So part of my research is about searching the most kind of mental health service for the international student, but I did find something about the online community about mental health and well-being support services. And thank you for the fantastic presentation about your research. And I thought it's something I connect about Neil's presentation and Isabel's is the online communities ethics. For the ethics, I would like to raise my worries about the ethics of the online community for the well-being and mental health. And as Isabel's presentation, that the online community most have anonymous apps, and also it is very common to see the anonymous apps or communities for mental health and well-being, because we think about protect those people, those users. However, there are some dark side about the anonymous online community about mental health and well-being, because those users, they are vulnerable population, and when they are vulnerable, they're more likely to be manipulated by some people who has the dark purpose, maybe on purpose, maybe unconsciously. And how could we deal with this issue? And it's not about, so as my observation, there are some small communities talking about suicide, and then it becomes they make a decision about suicide together rather than prevention suicide. And then some users trying to get some power from the other users in the community, but all these things are totally anonymous. And the other thing I've been noticed is some service, for example, the therapy service for some specific population or cohort, such as the sexual minorities, the price is much higher than the general population. And these, I feel that we could, I don't know how to deal with these concerns. And then after this problem was risen, I think it's my personal perspective that the world become more out of expectation than the Black Mirror. This is my worries.
Well, lots of relevant observations there. Shall we go to Neil first?
Yeah, so I mean, I was just struck by you very nicely articulated the kind of flip side of anonymity. So when I was presenting earlier, I just gave one side of the coin, as it were, about the benefits, which people have told us in studies time and time and time again, anonymity is helpful. It provides them with a sort of safety blanket, as it were, to venture into that space. But, and it's a very big but, there is the completely opposite side of anonymity, which you've just shared. And I think certainly reflecting on some of the studies we've done over the years, we absolutely have seen the negative impact of anonymity in examples where people are saying quite brutal things to others who are clearly vulnerable. And I should just caveat by saying that my research, I don't do this research in the context of one single condition or disease. I do it across probably about 30 to 40 different conditions, because I'm interested in the commonality across all of them, as opposed to a single condition. And we've seen some clear instances where the anonymity has provided individuals with that sense that they can say and do anything that they want, and that resonates with theories about, being, anonymity online, etc., etc. And that really is a problem. It's particularly a problem in communities where there is either no or there's limited active moderation. So how do you deal with this? Well, the only thing I've seen two ways of dealing with it. There may be others. One is around people scanning messages and spotting troublesome messages and removing them. But in some of these larger communities, we're talking, 10, 12,000 members, maybe higher. So is that feasible? No, I don't think it is, to be honest. We've just been working with Asthma UK because they're struggling to moderate and, sift through these messages. The other sort of side of that I've seen is around artificial intelligence screening the content of messages and trying to pick up on problematic keywords, phrases, etc., and using that as a tool to perhaps alert a human to then go and see the context of the interaction. So I think it's a really difficult challenge. The other sort of final thing I can say that I've seen that I think is to do with anonymity is people who fabricate their identities online. And I've seen that in a number of ways. I've seen it through people who have fabricated their illness. The illness actually doesn't exist. They've fabricated that for whatever reason, and they've narrated several months of illness content, but the community ultimately found out that they were not genuine. The other type of fabricated identity has actually been people trying to sell products, particularly drug treatments. And I've seen that, for example, the studies that spring to mind around inflammatory bowel disease, where it's it's a really difficult thing to manage. And drug reps, people, part of the pharmaceutical industry, some representatives actually fabricating an identity within these spaces to then share their story of apparent success with a particular drug. And that, I think, is a really, really scary thing to see, but it probably exists more than I think I have seen. So I absolutely endorse the kind of flip side of anonymity as well. How we deal with that is a big challenge going forward, very much so. I'll pass on to it.
Yeah, thank you for your question, Victoria. It was really nice to hear about your research. Something that, in terms of the ethics and kind of what you're struggling with, I think something that is great in many respects if you research any aspect of the internet is there's just so much stuff there. There's just so much data, there's so much information, and it is in some respects easier, as it's simpler, to just see what people are saying in contrast to trying to recruit people for interviews and focus groups and things like that. But that is a really obviously simplistic way of thinking about internet data for many, many reasons. And the way that I've started kind of trying to treat internet data, specifically social media data, is that if someone, for me, I feel like if someone is using a pseudonym, so as you described, they're kind of masking elements of their identity, even in cases where it's not explicit that they are in some way vulnerable, I feel like they maybe ought to be treated as such. Like there's a reason that this person doesn't want to be found. And so for me, you know, if I'm going to be collecting, like, say, comments on Instagram posts or whatever it is, I would be tempted to change the text of the post to avoid that person being kind of re-identified, because I feel like if you're not saying who you are and you're hiding any element of your identity, whether it's like crafting or, you know, something as really serious as the spaces that you're describing, you're telling the world you don't want to be found. And so for me, I'm just kind of moving towards that as an ethic, but with the caveat that it can't always be applied to every scenario. But I guess I'm just trying to say I share some of these struggles, and I really appreciate your comments and questions.
I wondered if you wanted to comment on the suicide and self-harm side of things, or should we take another? Take another. Okay, I think we've got an online question. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'll use my loud voice so that Al can pick me up. We've had a really interesting observation from somebody called Lawrence, who said, don't forget that any new technology has been seen in similar negative views. For example, you can find comments about early landline telephones saying it would be the end of society, as your manager would be able to contact you at any time of the night or day. When new social norms do emerge as these technologies become more accepted within society. So that's from Lawrence. Thank you, Lawrence. And then we also had a question as well, which I'll go on to if you hear that. So would the panel think of the term super user, would this be legally defined by tech companies, and how as general public a super user is addictive, especially for vulnerable people and unpaid carers with the fear of missing out? How do we get companies to portray digital good schemes that it is okay to switch off to bridge loneliness and isolation gaps for mental health?
Gosh, there's a lot in there. I'm still processing.
You want, whichever of you is ready to speak first.
Deal with the comment.
Yeah, go for it, yeah.
Well, I have some thoughts, but I'm quite interested to hear what you thought about the statement, because I feel like you've written about
The statement, the comment about.
Yeah, the comment, yeah, the newest one.
Well, I guess I wonder what the implications are, that there is always, you know, some horror and then it settles down and norms emerge. I think if you're researching digital technologies, you're always dealing with the new, aren't you? So you're talking about artificial intelligence, trying to identify possible sort of risky comments, and you're looking at secret telling apps as they emerge as a new sort of mobile phone use, and yeah, what I've focused on has changed over time, but I still think we have to ask ourselves or ask about the societal consequences of the technologies. And as you know, particular tech companies do become more and more powerful, and they provide the infrastructure of our lives, and that often exists outside regulation. So like water companies are regulated, but you know, internet platforms, because they're kind of global, transnational and fast-paced, are not as well regulated. So somebody has to be asking what's going on with this, is it okay how it's being used and deployed and regulated or not regulated. So maybe it's just a kind of consequence of dealing with the new. We still need to be kind of asking those questions. And maybe one of the interesting takes on that is when it's right to say no, let's not use this technology in this way. And I think it's really important for us on the Digital Good Network to be open to, you know, what's sometimes called abolitionism, but you know, the saying no, that's not how this technology should be used. So for example, in some states in the US, then police are no longer using facial recognition technology, because there's been a lot of sort of community sort of pushback against that and some kind of discriminatory consequences. So I think it's right to take the new and kind of shake it and then decide whether well, there is something that can be kind of so societally beneficial, or if it's really, really socially harmful, to kind of speak out.
So I'll just pick up on the issue of the super user. And I'm not sure this is an answer to the question. It's more a stream of consciousness as to what comes out when faced with that word super user, and mentally racking my brains to think, what do I know about the super user? What do we actually know? We don't know a huge amount, but we know it's difficult to accurately define what is a super user. Is this just somebody who spends a certain amount of time? Is it something to do with the volume of activity, the amount of messages they're posting? What is it? That, for me, the literature in my world is still very disjointed about what a super user is. However, what do we know about these people who use and participate in online support communities that might be defined as a super user, somebody who spends a lot of time, does a lot of stuff within these communities? We know that without them, the communities will probably break down. A few years ago, we published a paper looking, I think it was about over 900,000 different interactions within Asthma UK and the British Lung Foundation online communities. We were able to remove the contribution of these super users, and when we did, we could demonstrate that the community itself would collapse. So it tells me that whoever these people are, whatever we want to define them, there's something important about what they do that helps the community evolve, develop, thrive, one could perhaps argue. But going beyond that, we know that they are likely to be people who have joined the community because they have a need. They've spent the first period of time addressing that need. They've got support, they've got help, they're perhaps in a better place. And their activity now is about giving back as opposed to being helped. They are helping rather than being helped. So the roles have changed. That does sort of imply that they are trying to do some good, perhaps, but without them, there is problems because the communities will not thrive, the connections won't be made. So there is some colleagues in the UK who almost consider them as a kind of unpaid workforce, that they could perhaps help people to develop those self-management skills around long-term conditions, for example, to perhaps ease the burden from healthcare services. I sort of appreciate that. I can see where that fits in. I'm probably slightly less comfortable with describing them as a workforce, isn't it? I don't know, it feels a little bit off for me. But anyway, the idea that there is a resource there that could potentially sustain a community to achieve some good kind of appeals to my thinking about it. So I think what I know at the moment about super users, we need to find out more, and maybe in time we need to encourage more people to become these super users, or whatever label we want to give them, because there's something perhaps good that they're doing.
Yes.
Harry Churchill from the University of Sheffield, and I've just started a project looking at online resources and e-support for parents, and websites and apps kind of things. But yeah, I'd like to ask a question about regulation and corporate power, because obviously the big tech companies' narrative with the good digital is it's all about freedom of expression and no regulation, and that's the whole point of digital and all these connections and everything. And to bring in more of a society of welfare, equality, social justice. Do you automatically come to clash with that, and it's all about tech power, and how do we regulate things, how do we design digital platforms and products so they have the kinds of affordances and things that are going to kind of fit more with people's idea of the good digital, like young people's idea of what they want to do on social media. And so I was just wondering how kind of like regulation and regulating the digital world, but particularly the corporate big tech companies, kind of comes in, you think, because you're actually clashing with their idea of the good digital.
So can we get anywhere?
So what I'm just wondering in terms of, so my project, for example, I'm gonna need to engage with the idea of regulating. So the idea, for example, of peer support communities for parents. Is it better that they're moderated? Is it better that they have kind of facilities so they're not just, so they're not highly unregulated and kind of platforms? And if you're looking at a state-funded type kind of online community or online resource, which kind of digital tech companies should they be working with in terms of that? But then also it comes back to like the online harms bill, and should we be moving towards more regulation? Is that, yeah?
Yes, good question. We've got 1 minute left, so maybe I've used the phrase that Dana Boyd used, which is it's complicated. I mean, you know, you've got regulation at all sorts of different levels, haven't you? And Isabel's looked at how platforms do content moderation, and then you're talking about maybe smaller scale operations. You've talked about only join moderated online health communities. And then you've got, you know, nationwide regulation. I mean, I think for me, my answer would depend on kind of what level of regulation you're talking about. It is an uphill battle. I think that there is, honestly, I think there's quite a lot of fear of getting technology wrong, getting AI wrong at the moment. I think there is a reasonable amount of awareness of things like sort of the discriminatory consequences of some kind of AI uses. I think there is a little bit of openness to maybe getting the regulation, getting the policy right. What that looks like in reality, I don't know. Platforms, I would say, are well intended when they do content moderation, but the consequences are not always the consequences that they intend. And maybe we have to leave it at that, because time is up, but we can definitely kind of carry on the conversation longer. But I don't want to go over time and keep people for longer than they thought they would be here. Massive thanks for joining us online. Massive thanks for coming along and being here in the room and asking really great questions. Huge thanks to Neil and Isabel for having a conversation with each other and just raising lots of really, really interesting and important things. Thanks to our team in the corner there, Ruth, Nikki and Xiaoying, who helped to run the session, and to the Festival of Social Science for supporting it. Thank you, everybody.